Good morning. Great to see some old friends in the audience. Michael, long time no see. I wanted to congratulate Caroline and USC for fantastic work, the research, and keeping the conversation going front and center. I also wanted to thank you for organizing a crosstown rivalry panel. You may not have realized this, but, and here Ann comes. We have a couple of very proud UCLA urban planning graduate students here representing the other side of town, as well as a couple folks from USC. So we'll see what happens. The sparks may fly. We wanted to, and I got here a little bit late, and we may have already gone over some of these findings from the report. But we did, welcome Ann. We did want to highlight some of the key findings from the report. We got a sneak peek over the weekend, had some time to kind of go through it. And there were a few findings on this topic in particular that we wanted to lay out to kind of help set the stage for the conversation. So I'm just going to go through those really quick. I'm not an academic, so I'm a banker. I get, I get notes. I get to prepare. Key finding number one, the scale of NOAA in LA County is significant. I mean, this is something that really I took away from the report. The report estimates that there are over 800,000 naturally occurring affordable housing units in LA County, with the most affordable properties, which are, as Manuel properly, the core NOAA. The smaller and older properties, 5 to 19 units, representing about 25% of all occupied rental properties in the county. This translates, I did a little bit of math, about 1.7 million people, 1.7 million tenants living in NOAA properties in Los Angeles. So pretty significant. Key finding number two, like many things in Los Angeles, the distribution of NOAA properties across the region is uneven. The largest number of properties are located in Hollywood, Studio City, San Fernando Valley, and Long Beach markets. And then the greatest concentration of NOAA are in neighborhoods like Koreatown, Hollywood, Studio City again, and then in the Burbank, Glendale market. So, disproportionate, or unevenly distributed across the county. And then finally, NOAA households are diverse, often long tenured. I think it was 10 years plus in NOAA properties compared to most rental properties, and generally still remain rent burdened. So 30 to 50% of household income going towards rent on NOAA properties. So with that, I know folks have bios in their program, so we won't go through that. But I think this opening question sort of will help folks, get a sense of, the work that we're currently doing for each other, or, the panelists. And so we're going to open with, tell us how your work is related to preservation of naturally occurring affordable housing or other housing, and that's for all the panelists. And KeAndra, why don't we start with you?
Okay, can you hear me okay? All right, hi everybody. Happy to start. I'm particularly interested in highlighting the partnership that we have with USC. So at LACAHSA, we are focused on increasing the development and preservation of affordable homes, both rental and ownership. Part of this partnership included a focus on really building a comprehensive affordable housing supply database to really better understand the existing housing supply and get into the details. Where is it located? What are the trends that we're seeing over time? Where are we seeing more produced? Where are we seeing more at-risk units? How do we identify those at-risk units? And so this partnership that focused on developing a NOAA methodology was really crucial. A first phase for us, because we do plan to continue building out that database at understanding that existing housing supply. And then the goal is to be able to use that information to help prioritize our investments, to help us understand, what policy changes might be helpful in order to preserve and produce more affordable housing generally, and really understand the impact of our investments, especially as a newer agency, but also importantly, how are we able to track these at-risk units? What are the key factors that we need to be paying attention to that we're not paying attention to? And then are there policy decisions at the local level, at the state level, things that we should be pursuing to help us solve the question that was asked earlier? How do we address this big gap in our RENA goals, given the track that we're on now? It's certainly not an easy question to answer, but I think some of it starts with really closely looking at this data and this information in partnership with our other county partners and city partners, and of course the state, and really focusing on, how do we use that information to make better decisions, make better investments as we move forward. So I'll just highlight that specific project first.
Thank you, KeAndra. Araceli?
Yes, thank you. I know we're going to be talking a lot about the preservation of NOAA, so I'm going to use this intro question to talk a little bit about some of the work at Enterprise that we're doing on the subsidized side of affordable housing, because I think it's worth mentioning for the conversation of preservation. So in the past several years, our team at Enterprise has really shifted or expanded our focus of preservation to include partner sustainability as part of our preservation strategy, just recognizing and hearing from our partners the battles and challenges that they are experiencing, and serious financial strain across their portfolios and projects. And the reason why we care about this, right, is because these are the folks who are driven by the mission, serving communities. And if we don't support them in doing so, we risk losing these units. So at Enterprise, we've really tried to tackle the issue from that side, and doing specific targeted work on the preservation of PSH, which is permanent supportive housing, doing technical assistance on asset management, and from a policy standpoint, which is really the work that I do as part of a team, really focusing on the policy solutions at a state level and local level to address some of those operational challenges, those pressure points that our affordable housing partners are experiencing. And one of the issues we've been doing a lot of work on is insurance. And when I took this job at Enterprise, I did not expect I was going to be working on insurance so much. But as you know, right, it is a huge challenge for just across housing, but specifically for affordable housing providers. And so we've been advancing efforts to expand insurance options for affordable housing providers, while at the same time exploring forms of financial relief or flexibility from the State Department to address this issue. But I wanted to kind of speak on that during this question, because I think, part of the message that as an advocate we take to Sacramento is ensuring that we don't lose that perspective from the affordable housing provider standpoint, and making sure that, that we're telling the full picture of what is happening across affordable housing. So, and then I'll talk about the NOAA stuff too later on, but wanted to take the opportunity to highlight some of that work.
Thanks, Araceli. And yeah, insurance is a critical piece. I see it in our portfolio, and I could go into more detail. I think we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But Anne, welcome.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Sorry to be late. I thought for sure we'd get a 5-minute break, but no, we're staying on schedule. For the past 16 months, I've had the pleasure of being at the Los Angeles County Development Authority, working exclusively on preservation. Well, not exclusively. I worry about fires too, but we're working exclusively almost on preservation of our covenanted affordable housing stock. Out of 250 projects that are actually up and running and have been up and running for at least 5 years, that's about 12,400 units. Almost half are financially or physically upside down. And when I said this in our prep call, Araceli gasped and said, "You can't say that. We're about to vote on a bond." Happy thoughts, happy thoughts. And I said, well, the happy thought is that there are solutions, and that we are putting those solutions into effect. We've done a couple of pilot projects. We're going to the Board of Supervisors next month as part of the budget authorization to have the resources to really launch the program. And we expect that we'll do about 850 units in this fiscal year in 19 properties. So there's definitely solutions. It's not a panic thing. But the way that that relates to NOAA, which, not to be snarky, although that is my job on this panel, I would in some ways call TOA because it's temporarily occurring affordable housing. The big difference is, covenanted, it's going to be here for 55 years, 90 years, whatever. Temporary is until your lovely landlord dies and his evil children come along and go, what are you talking about? We could have raised the rents, or whatever other things occur. So I think that's one of the big differences. But the similarities are whether you are TOA or covenanted affordable housing, insurance is going up, utilities are going up, the cost of any repairs and maintenance is going up. And so everybody's facing those same challenges, and we'll be talking about that.
Thanks, Ann. And I guess next year's report, we might have to change the title. But and I was just going to mention my work. I've been a banker for almost 30 years in the affordable housing arena. It's primarily on the subsidized LIHTC space, finance, construction, and permanent financing for LIHTC, primarily affordable housing. And a lot of that has been preservation. A lot of that has been acquisition rehab of existing developments, both in California and throughout the Western U.S. And then the bank also, and like many banks, invest in preservation funds, whether it's directly through LIHTC syndicated funds that have preservation assets included in those, as well as just dedicated preservation funds that have been established that typically finance or look to provide equity on LIHTC properties that are ending their 15-year compliance cycle, and they're looking for bridge financing to then be repositioned, typically down the road as re-syndicated new LIHTC properties. So that's sort of been my work over the past many, many years, and how I've sort of have been in the preservation field. And just to kind of transition a little bit, what challenges are the same in trying to preserve NOAA as there are for other on the subsidized affordable arena?
So years and years ago, when the low-income housing tax credit program was new, we used to be able to figure out, if your average rent was going to be somewhere between 50 and 60% of area median income, meaning you were going below what we're talking about in this report is, low income, 80%. And your expenses were whatever expenses were, and you ran them out so that expenses rose a little bit more than incomes over, 30 years. It would work forever. It's not like your lines between expenses and income would cross in year, 25 or something. It could go on forever. And about 5 years ago, that whole dynamic changed. Not only insurance, which was the most visible thing, but utilities, being a little bit of a nerd, I sat down last night and looked at it. Between 2015 and 2025, utility costs in Los Angeles County, not just EWP customers, although they're the leaders, rose from $47 per unit per month to $127, 170% increase. And in covenanted affordable housing projects, that comes off the rent. In your NOAA project, the tenant continues to pay those rising utilities as well as the rent. But so, one of the problems that we're seeing with both of them is, people can buy less because of rent because they're paying more in utilities. So that's a huge part of it. At the same time, the rents on covenanted properties for 50% families rose from $961 a month in a 2-bedroom unit to $1,700, about a 77% increase, which is not as much as just the utilities out of all of the costs that go into it rose. Incomes, of course, didn't rise as much as either one of those. I think they rose 50% over that period of time. So, you've got this huge, we can certainly deal with it from the income side too, but you've got basically revenue is not keeping up with expenses, whether you are in a NOAA property or a covenanted property. And that's something that we can address on all of them.
Yeah, no, I think that that's really helpful. I remember one of the senior bankers when I started about 25 years ago said, all the risk is in construction. Once these things are built, it's like clockwork. And what's been really interesting, I'd say in the last 2.5, 3 years, of all the downgraded credits in my portfolio, and then I sit on a couple affordable housing boards that manage large portfolios. We're seeing cracks on the stabilized portfolios, not on so construction risk is construction risk, but where we're seeing challenges is really on the stabilized portfolios, and you elevated exactly kind of what those challenges have been. I was also going to mention, though, that for when you think about approaches and solutions for NOAA versus the existing sort of subsidized arena, there's a 40-year infrastructure and institutions that have been built around subsidized affordable housing, government, capital, Wall Street. And so I think, as we're thinking about the solutions for NOAA, how do we link to those institutions to sort of address the capital needs and learning sort of to address some of the concerns or preservation of NOAA. So let's see, Araceli, the work you're doing at Enterprise around policy, I think fits well with this next question in terms of, what findings from the report that could inform legislation or investment to make it easier to preserve NOAA?
Yeah, so I think you started with the finding that summarizing the findings I most appreciated, because I think the report really does a effective job at painting the scale of NOAA in LA County. And in the context of Los Angeles, where NOAA makes up a majority of units that are affordable to local residents. And we know that as we lose those units, folks are getting displaced. And this is especially true in communities of colors. What happens is that this type of data really helps prioritize findings. So now I am excited to get to talk a little bit about a bill that we at Enterprise are sponsoring, Senate Bill 1091 by Senator Caballero, which I think was designed in response to some of the needs that we were seeing across the state. So Senate Bill 1091 would establish the Community Anti-Displacement and Preservation Program, or I'm going to say CAP for short, so I don't take up too much time saying that full name. But we're really excited about this bill because it would be a new statewide program that would provide the necessary resources to acquire and preserve at-risk, currently unsubsidized affordable housing before it's gone. And I'll mention, Anne brought it up earlier, there is also a affordable housing bond on the ballot in November, which has efforts in parallel to CAP, which would include a $200 million allocation for CAP, which we are really encouraged by. It'll show up as Prop 1 on your ballot. But we strongly believe that preservation programs like CAP are really critical for slowing down the rate of loss and ultimately keeping residents in their homes. I know that LACAHSA has funding for similar purposes, acquisition, preservation, and related efforts. And I think the findings from the report really support the efforts that are coming out of state legislature and LACAHSA. And so all of that is really useful as advocates when we're asking decision makers and electeds to make these types of investments. They want to know what the impact will be, what's the data that we have on this, and we can point to reports like this to help support our advocacy.
And Araceli, is that legislation also intended to support deed restricted properties as well?
No, this is for unsubsidized affordable housing.
Great. And not to pick on you, Araceli, but we got one more. So the next, and I think this also ties into your comments around working with community partners and sponsors, developers, and I think also related to, I mentioned earlier, sort of the key finding that you have concentrations in neighborhoods of NOAA and concentrations of the share of NOAA in certain markets. So I thought can you talk about what the role local communities or community organizations, political leaders either play or can play in helping preserve NOAA assets, especially in neighborhoods and markets where we're seeing concentrations in LA, Koreatown, Hollywood Studio City, those types of markets, and KeAndra certainly weigh in.
Yeah, well, maybe I can start by offering a really specific example of some of the work that we have been doing or did and have been learning from. We know that from our work in this space that most of the unsubsidized affordable housing are owned and operated by small landlords, and most of them, or the ones that we were able to work with as part of a project that we did, are really committed to serving these communities and often live in the same communities, but they lack the capital and technical support to sustain their properties. And so one project that I'd like to highlight that was led by our team at Enterprise is LROC, short for the Local Rental Owners Collaborative, which was a 5-year pilot program that really focused on the preservation of unsubsidized affordable housing by doing deep engagement with small-scale landlords in South LA. So it was targeted to the neighborhood. And what the team did was provide capital solutions, but also some deep technical assistance, and really kind of brought in the small landlords as partners into the work and empowered them to create owner-centered approaches to preserving those units. And so I would say direct outreach and targeted work in these neighborhoods would be effective, and supporting models like LROC would be an effective strategy. And ultimately, to Anne's point about, when landlords die and their kids come in and they're evil and they sell their properties, we can work with them to think about incentives, right? What can we do to keep those properties in the community, keep them affordable? But we need that level of partnership there. So I would point to models like that. I don't know if you want to weigh in.
Maybe not evil. But sorry, did you want me to?
If you want to add on or comment, or KeAndra.
Okay. I was thinking of Manuel's, what was it? Data, deliberation, destiny, as it relates to this. We've, for 4 years before my current stint, I had the joy of being the head of the city of LA's housing department, which meant I got to spend a lot of time in council meetings listening to people argue, about landlords versus tenants or whatever. And there was no shared understanding of what was going on with operating real estate, in Los Angeles. It was definitely somebody's trying to soak me, somebody's trying to, make it really hard for me to run my small business. And so I think starting with data, one of the things, I reflect on some of the things I did while I was at the city, and there are things that I'm proud of, and there's things that are like, and when you do a study about costs of operating housing going forward, probably, maybe for next year, if you're going to start looking at the costs of NOAA or whatever, don't look at, core inflation or personal expenditures with 20 things in your basket of goods and services. Look at the 8 things that property owners spend their money on, and it's really simple. It's insurance, it's taxes, it's staffing, it's maintenance, repairs, utilities. And look at those things and how they're changing, and then try to build a common understanding, because, a consultant that we work with at our department, and sometimes, I know LACAHSA has been working with, has been charged with working with community or, neighborhood people who want to buy their buildings, and really doing the education about what does it cost to operate this. And when people start to really understand that this isn't like a free path to riches. You are taking on responsibility for paying the bills, and the bills are up here and your rents are right here. And how are you going to work that out? That's a really good thing to problem solve before you buy the building as opposed to after. So I think I would say that start with real data and make sure that everybody is involved in coming up with that and understands what it means, and that actions are based on that.
I think that's a great point, Anne, and it kind of speaks to what I wanted to highlight just about another way that we're kind of answering your question about marrying the more experienced developers in that kind of infrastructure. There are a growing number of developers, some community-based, some community land trusts that are coming in as nonprofits and helping organize with tenants to acquire and maintain those properties as either community land trusts or other forms of social housing. They experience some of the same challenges, but that's another way that folks are working to preserve some of these NOAA properties. Importantly, and just to kind of take it back to the SOLACHAN report, one thing to highlight is that in many of these properties, folks are cost burdened. And so looking at what level of subsidy is needed to keep them housed over time is a challenge, right? But just wanted to highlight that as another example.
I think we have a question on that coming up here. So, this conversation also makes me think about the work and the institutions that have been the programs that have been built around first-time home buyers, sort of more on the single-family side, the technical assistance, financial literacy, and that whole infrastructure that exists, and again, beginning to think about how to shift that to sort of the mom and pop, the community providers, developers, and providing that, sort of building a whole new infrastructure to support those small property owners. So, KeAndra, since we have you here, what opportunities do we have with local funds like Measure A to accelerate the preservation of affordable housing? I know LACAHSA is deeply aligned with Measure A, so yeah.
Absolutely. So yes, we are funded by Measure A. And as was mentioned earlier, we have already started investing not only in the production of affordable housing, but also in preservation through our first NOFA. But more kind of looking forward, we are also going to be issuing a NOFA that is specifically focused on community land trust and NOAA. It's going to offer unique financing products that will allow us to target these developments, including shared equity models to support NOAA acquisition and sort of social housing models. And we'll be doing that later this fall. It'll be about $25 million invested. That's what's approved in our budget. But we are also looking more long-term at developing a preservation impact fund. And, this will be broader, looking at preservation from existing affordable housing, subsidized affordable housing, to also potentially NOAA. Like we're still figuring out the details, but we are focused on really raising more capital to help our funding stretch. We'll use seed funding to build it. And over time, the goal is to really make this a long-term sustainable source of funding for which we can really focus on preserving affordable housing of different types. So we have a couple different ways that we are investing in the short term and then in the long term under Measure A.
No, that's great. And I think, it's exciting to know that we have Measure A, we have ULA, we have the bond measure, that, we have sources that have not been there. I mean, HHH is sort of winding down. So, that's fantastic. And kind of getting back to subsidies and how they might be a solution. I wanted to ask, are there any drawbacks to investing housing subsidies in preserving NOAA? In KeAndra and Araceli?
I guess the first thing I'll say is there are trade-offs because we have limited funding. I think that's one of the biggest challenges, right? We have a recent influx with Measure A, with ULA and other funding sources, but it's limited. And the challenges are growing as we have aging properties, especially our older affordable housing, subsidized affordable housing. And as we learn more about the NOAA properties, we know that's just a huge stock in general. And so it's a matter of prioritizing, but we need both. But I'll turn it over to Ann.
I was trying to think of a good way to make this a joke. Like, when does a NOAA property stop being a NOAA property? When it gets public money and it has covenants and restrictions and rules about who lives there. It's not really a joke because, we all vote. How many voted for Measure A? A lot of us in this room probably. I have a vivid memory of the pictures that came to my house with the pamphlet saying vote for Measure A. It did not have higher income people living in charming NOAA apartments in Atwater. It had people living on the street or people who were, cost burden. And it was very clear that I was voting to help people who needed public subsidy to be housed. And one of the problems with NOAA, and, fix this next time, please, Richard and Carolyn, is it's really hard to know who lives there. It's a shovel, not a scalpel. Like, the way we captured NOAA in this report, it can include those cute $5,000 a month apartments in Atwater that people love because they're older and charming. And that have people who can afford to pay those rents living in them. So, what are we when we start targeting and start spending public money, it becomes covenanted affordable housing with all the rules and responsibilities, tied to that. So, I think that's one of the opportunities and challenges. Almost any NOAA building that we've seen is not purely low income. It's a mix. It's probably one of the benefits of it. It has a mix of rents. But our money tends not to come in that flavor of, mix of rents kind of thing. So thinking about how to maybe change that, make that not on a voter approved thing, but in other things would be good. So yeah, and then the other thing is really, it's going to have the same challenges in terms of rising expenses, in terms of any building that's of any age needs rehab, needs freshening up. One of the problems with the covenanted affordable housing stuff is it's now 40 years old and, it needs roofs and plumbing systems and everything, redone. So, and most of the time, the cash flows do not allow you to just squirrel that away and spend it every 40 years. It takes a new financing event to do that. So this may be that financing event for some of those buildings.
Araceli, I don't know if you had a comment on that. Okay. Yeah, no, I think KeAndra, as you talked, how do you prioritize one over the other, or how do you build programs that sort of run in parallel paths? I think that's the challenge because it's a preservation. Based on the scale, the preservation is critical. But then you have the challenges of how that happens in practice. I agree.
Well, and also, if we think about it, the goals of increasing the affordable housing stock, you have to also preserve, because if we're losing at the same or a faster rate, we're just constantly behind. So we have to prioritize. It's just a matter of finding that balance.
I was looking at a credit presentation this morning, a 315 unit new building out in Warner Center, $135 million total project cost. With significant amount of public resources. So, you think about preserving 315 units, it's a much smaller price tag.
But is it?
Well, I think over time, maybe no. But that's the question, right? How do you?
I have a slightly different take on we have to save it because it's, first of all, we're losing it just through time because even if we were counting incomes, people's incomes hopefully are rising. Rents are rising. It's naturally just sitting there becoming less affordable as it also becomes older and more expensive. And what else I suspect it is that would be a good thing to look at is it is probably a lot less dense than what could be built to replace it. And we have, I just want to give a shout out, see my friend Jonathan back there. We have some very good state laws that protect tenants in those buildings, AB, SB, whatever, 330, 7, so on and so forth, that require a right of return if you're low income, require relocation. Depending on where you live, there may be other benefits, like in the city in a rent stabilized building. And so, for me, tearing down 4 units that are NOAA and having the tenants move back and getting covenants in those buildings for 55 years, targeted to, making sure those low-income residents will always be replaced by other low-income residents if they move. I think that's a win if you can go from 4 units to 100 units or something like that. And we don't really talk about that because it's kind of crunchy to talk about tearing down people's homes. So, I'm just saying that at some point converting to a higher density city means converting to a higher density city.
It makes me think about other, SB 79 and the densification and how that, the reaction of, the NIMBY sort of, as you well know. So lots of challenges, but solutions, to your point. I think we had just one more question, and then do we have time to open it up? Okay. So this question is if this report tracked the status of NOAA in LA County over several years, what additional data would help inform our policy choices? Let's just open it up to the whole panel.
Well, I already offered mine, but I would love to see who's living in NOAA and what is their rent burden. Where would it make sense to encourage protection of NOAA based on high numbers of lower income residents in buildings? What is the land use redevelopment potential of NOAA? And do we need to increase even more substantial tenant protections if we're opening up that conversation? And what's the long-term financial prognosis for NOAA in various neighborhoods? If you just leave it alone, as we've sort of left the covenanted housing stock alone, it's going to need more work and more financial investment, and that's going to lead to a need for higher rents. And so what happens, to those smaller, older buildings as they become even older?
I think looking at units that are 41 units, so smaller buildings, right? I think that's understandably an area we talked about. I feel like this is an unfair advantage because I had more time to talk to on this project. But that's an area we know there are more NOAA properties, and we know there are probably unique challenges within those compared to some of the bigger buildings. But better understanding that would be really helpful. I think also understanding the implication of rent stabilization on these rents and whether they are the key reason that some of these properties have lower rents as we, compare the actual rents to the other characteristics. And, you don't have that. It's hard to analyze that, but that would be helpful because that's a significant portion of the county with the city being already, roughly 40%, or at least of people. And I had one more thought, but I forgot. So I will turn it over to Araceli.
Thank you. Yeah, well, I feel like +1 to everything that has already been said. I think all of that would be incredibly helpful. And I think about maybe a different way to get at this question is also like what additional data partnerships are needed to understand or get some of those questions answered. And for me, I think about how do we create tools from the data to understand the risk of loss, to answer the question of at what point do we invest, at what point do we think differently about what we can do on that lot or on that property. And so I think for me, it would be understanding the risk of loss, what the kind of opportunity is for those lots or those properties. And then I think all of that would help us with the solutions that are coming out of LACAHSA in terms of the types of programs and investments. And there's a lot of really great technical assistance work that's coming out of LACAHSA, and how do we tie what we're learning to design that technical assistance for some of this work? So yeah, that would be my answer.
Thank you. And just to add to that, I think in terms of disposition and the velocity of loss, who's buying? Are these institutional investors? Are they other mom and pops? And I think the report talks about that a little bit. That maybe it's not as many institutional investors as you might think, but it doesn't. But I think a little bit more work and data collection on that front, I think, would be appealing. So with that, I believe we are going to throw it out to you all and ask questions from the audience. Yes. I believe there's a mic coming around there. Thank you.
Back to just focusing on the issue around NOAA and thinking of NOAA not only as a way to affordability, but also income inclusive housing, and also reducing the displacement of seniors and working families that are ineligible for housing assistance. Has there been any thought around that? Because I think that's the real value in NOAA.
I think that's a great point and comes up a lot when we talk about like community land trust and social housing and finding ways to organize tenants to be able to maintain the housing, both for income purposes. Also, this is where they've lived forever and want to stay. And this is one way to do it because maybe their incomes are a little too high for low income housing. And so, what's the risk if that property is acquired and then converted into a subsidized unit? I think it's not talked about enough. But I think that those are kind of the areas where I'm starting to hear more of these discussions.
I think that's a really great point. In some ways, almost every dime we all have as public agencies is targeted to people who are lower income, and there's that group of people who are, the missing middle or moderate income, who aren't eligible. The rents those people could afford to pay can make it work for the problem that I'm seeing of no matter what you do, if you are 100% very low income, you're not going to keep up with expenses over a 30, 40, 50-year period of time. If we had more mixing of incomes, that could solve that problem. That's a legislative change. But you know what? Legislative changes happen all the time. So, maybe that's something to think about.
And you hit on two of the key findings from the report, diversity of tenants and tenure of residents, which are both key findings. And so the preservation question is critical. Michael.
The sideburns and the gray hair looks pretty good for an old guy.
Thank you, Michael. Good to see you too.
So I have a question about just affordable housing in general. Would anybody up there on the panel believe that there is what I'd call a affordable housing industrial complex? One is it exists. And then we've had rent control for nearly 50 years, I think now. What would you, in your opinion, where you sit today, you would like to see if this complex exists? What's the one thing you'd like to see it do in the next 10 years?
I'd like to consign the phrase affordable housing industrial complex to the same place where Trump derangement syndrome lives or whatever. I mean, I find it offensive. Not that I find the second one offensive necessarily, but I think there are a group of people, affordable housing in my 40 plus years of doing this started as a movement and became more, a group of people with expertise to make things happen. And yeah, there's banks and there's developers and there's architects and there's all sorts of people who make it happen. That's true of any endeavor that we have, to produce things. So usually when I hear people say it, it's like basically the next sentence coming out of their mouths is going to be, so let's put all our eggs in a basket of people who've never done it before because they must be great because they've never done it before. So they can't be accused of being part of the affordable housing industrial complex. I think the issue of rent stabilization, what has it achieved, is really complex and fascinating and worth looking at. And the city of LA has just started 3 years ago, asking people for, for the rent date, the actual rent data. It used to just track you can't increase it more than this, but now it actually collects rent. What it doesn't really collect is income. We don't ask the tenants for their income. But you could with One of Richard's colleagues, Marlon Barnett, about 8 years ago, did a study about the impact of housing development around transit using franchise tax board data that could look at the actual parcel level of the tax returns, of California tax returns. So you could figure out incomes as they changed over time. And one of the conclusions that he found that was sort of off topic, but comparing rent stabilized properties with nearby, like West LA to Culver City, which didn't have rent stabilization. Over 20 years, they ended up at sort of the same place. It found that rent stabilization sort of smoothed out the increases as opposed to eliminating them. But it'd be really interesting. There's all sorts of things you could do, but you'd have to be mixing, inputs to census and tax and other inputs to be able to get that done. But I would applaud you're urging the city to do it, but it's a big task, to look at the impact of that.
Hi, my name is Roy Payan. Good to see you, Dr. Green. It's good to see you again. But I want to address the issue of SB 79. In Northeast Los Angeles, throughout Highland Park, Eagle Rock, up to Atwater and Los Feliz, we're facing a lot of growing development and displacement and gentrification in our communities. That's chasing out whole communities of color in favor of white gentrification in our communities. My issue is that none of these new developments are dealing with people with disabilities or seniors or families with kids. And so it makes it unaffordable for us as people of color, especially if we're disabled. And so I want to know how you see the forecast of how SB 79 is going to impact our communities. And secondly, why are developers allowed to use TOD and TOC loans, which are low-income loans, for 100% of those loans, and then only provide 10% units for low-income families?
I can't really speak to the SB 79 part of that question, but the transit-oriented communities part of the City of LA's plan is, their land use plan gives people bonus incentives in terms of development, more density, other things, in exchange for committing a minimum of 10% or more for affordable housing. It's not a loan. It's just you get an extra bonus in terms of your land use entitlements.
Yeah, I was just going to comment. The TOD projects that we've financed where you've then incorporate other public subsidy dollars have been 100% affordable. So I'm not familiar with TOD sources that only require 10%. Not that they don't exist, but I'm just not aware of them.
Hello. Hi. My name is Chevis Mays, and my question is, what affordable housing policy reforms are currently being considered, and what data is being used to determine which reform will produce the greatest number of truly affordable units for low-income and extremely low-income people? Thank you.
I kind of feel like that's beyond the scope of this panel or my expertise. Which policies or policy changes are being considered that would do the most for extremely low-income people? I feel like we've gone through years of a bunch of policy changes, trying to incentivize development, trying to protect tenants as you do that. I feel like this is the year of money. Like when I think about most of the changes going on is voters being asked to approve whether it was, Measure A or whether it was United House LA in the City of LA or now the statewide bond. It's really the year of thinking about how do you finance, 100% affordable or mixed affordable. I know that's not very satisfying it's a very good question and deserves a more complex answer. I just don't feel competent to give it.
And Araceli, you had talked about some proposals and legislative proposals that you guys are working on supporting.
Yeah. Well, I feel like I agree. This year is the year of the housing bond in the sense that it's our third try at it. We've been trying to get a bond passed through the legislature. The governor finally signed it this year. And the bond itself, I talked about one program, which is CAP, that is in the bond, but it also includes I don't have them all memorized, but a number of other production or programs for production and preservation, like the Portfolio Reinvestment Program, which has also been, it was only funded one time and was oversubscribed, but we saw how effective it can be. And so I think what you hear from many of our advocates is like, I feel like we've done a lot on streamlining, on trying to do the most to remove barriers, but we need the resources and the investments along these critical programs to actually get units through the pipeline. So yeah, I feel like the bond is probably the kind of the big thing to look out for this year.
Well, thank you first and foremost for everything and all the data. I haven't heard anyone kind of talk a little about the vacancies that we have in commercial and how that could be reutilized for housing, because I believe that's a huge opportunity in terms of being able to transform, underutilized spaces into housing. If we need so much housing and we have so much vacancy and we have an environmental crisis, why are we not moving towards that direction? And that's a way of densifying without necessarily bothering the people not in my backyard.
That's a great question. I think a little beyond our scope too, but I will say I wanted to highlight, so LACAHSA has several TA, technical assistance funding grants that we've provided, and we actually provided one to a organization that is focused on partnering with the city of Linwood to really focus on that, to look at their commercial corridors, explore where there are underutilized properties, assess the feasibility of converting them to affordable housing or other housing types within that corridor, with the same idea of kind of fitting within that footprint to increase density. So we're really excited to kind of just see how that pans out and what we could learn from that. I know that's just one example, but yeah, that's
My only additional comment is cost. Office conversion, from everything developers have told me, is very expensive. It has a lot to do with the way office is built, and the floor plates and the verticals are not as conducive to conversion as it seems they would be. So that's just a comment, but something that I think certainly should be explored.
I just want to make a quick comment on that because I agree with you. So I think we are going to see more of a shift. It's already happening. And we acquired 8 acres that was 120,000 on Friday square foot office building. They're 4 stories. So those are going away. The reuse of existing is very complicated. But I think we're going to see more. There's a lot of state law. We just did a church parking lot and keeping the existing church, retail centers, things that were never ever thought of for housing will become housing. It is a movement that is occurring with state law. But I wonder from you, Stephen, because I'm listening to what you're all talking about, which is great. We all want to build more, build more, build more. I'm thinking about who is going to be building all this. So we're talking about bigger densities and bigger buildings, and we were at a point where we had a shortage on trades, and then we've had a slowdown on multifamily and on production housing. But when I look at the pipeline, and you're doing a ton of underwriting on market rate and affordable, and we always hear from our trades, which I'm not sure how we get back there, but they will tell us that in the 80s and early 90s, the people that framed the houses could actually buy the houses. The people that were doing the plumbing, the HVAC, everything, they could live in these communities. But if we can't even house the people that are going to build the communities, I think there's a bigger issue. But I wonder if that's something you're looking at from the
Well, I
bank in the
think,
future.
yeah, no, it's a good question and comment. And, you think about the labor side, you also think, we just financed a development in San Diego that is a ground lease provided by the state of California through San Diego State University. I think it's a total of 14 acres. We financed the first phase of it. I think is 130 units. With many of those units are going to be set aside for professors at SDSU. And then building out the entire development, I think was going to be 1,400 units. So, I mean, there's efforts along those ways. I think the current federal policy around immigration is having an impact on labor. We hear that from our developers and their general contractors. Yeah, there are real challenges but again, I'm optimistic that there are also solutions.
think part of the solution is going to be figuring out how to bring more people into the state to help with the housing crisis, because otherwise we're going to have major inflationary pressures. They're going to continue to push the cost up, and it's this continuous cycle, and then developers aren't going to want to build. So I just think it's something that what you're all doing, that there's a bigger piece to it of who is really going to be living here and who we're building for and housing. And I love what you guys are doing with professors, and we need to have that where people can live in these communities that they're working in as well. But I think we're all going to need to really look at who's going to be building in the future here, because we are talking about not hundreds of units anymore. And that's what I loved about SOLACHAN. You're showing where it's compressing. If everything goes right, that is going to flip really quick. And you're going to be sitting here, I hope, and saying, oh my God, we're building 50,000 homes. And it's just going to be a question that I think, and I don't know if it's a SOLACHAN thing, maybe there's a new report we can create, but what are we going to build? Who's going to be building it?
No, we're going to keep doing this one.
Yeah, well, no, it could be, there could be an add-on. But anyway, I just wonder where that all, and I don't know if any of you have a view in your underwriting today when you're looking at these things on thinking about that.
The last big push that we had when people started building affordable housing after HHH was passed, I could drive down the freeway and see cars with Texas license plates, and your trucks, not cars, pickups, Texas license plates, Nevada, Arizona. And you would see that these projects all require project labor agreements, everything funded with LACAHSA and other, so not only prevailing wage, but, relationships with unions. And you've got unions going to Texas to get plasterers and bringing them here just to work and then go back home to wherever they lived. So I think that's and yet Texas is also having the same problems that we're having with immigration and everything. So it's a really good question.
Well, I was going to say, join me in thanking our panelists, and now you have to clap again. And I want to give my thanks to you all for your attention. I want to call up Richard to do just a quick closing remarks, and thank you, and we'll see you again next year.
So I want to ask 4 questions to lead to a big picture, and then some thank yous. So here are the 4 questions. Okay. Top 10, bottom 10, somewhere in the middle. California, last 15 years, per capita GDP. Top 10, bottom 10 in the middle. How many of you think top 10? Bottom 10. Somewhere in the middle. Okay. Number 2. Okay. Now, this is not a great measure of living standards, but of productivity, it is. Greenhouse gas emissions, top highest, top lowest, 10 highest, 10 lowest, somewhere in the middle. Per capita, yeah, greenhouse gas emissions per capita. California, top 10 in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, so that's bad. Bottom 10 is good here, somewhere in the middle. How many of you think top 10? Somewhere in the middle. Bottom 10. We're number 2. We have the second lowest greenhouse gas emissions per capita of any state in the country. Part of it's our climate. I mean, it's not so much, we're virtuous, but we also don't have to, we're warm and we're not too hot and we're not too cold. That helps a lot too. Okay, that's the second question. Third question, relative to population, share of people who leave a state in a year. Are we among the 10 highest in terms of the share that leave, the 10 lowest, or somewhere in the middle? Okay, get the idea? Okay. Highest, the greatest share leaving, top 10. Somewhere in the middle, bottom 10, okay? We have the third lowest share of people of the 50 states leaving, okay? People like to stay here if they can. All right, but 4th question, relative to population, number of people who move in. Highest, middle, lowest. How many think highest? Share of people who move in, relative to population. Okay, middle, lowest. Okay, we are at the absolute bottom in terms of share of people relative to our population. So people, there's the story about the exodus. There's no exodus, but people aren't coming. Why not? Because they can't afford to be here. we should be welcoming people here. We're a productive place for people to work, and we're better for the planet than pretty much, I'm trying to remember, I think Colorado may be number one. There's one that beats us out, but we do really well. And so I'm thinking about Scott's point about 40 million to 50 million, and we're stuck at 40. We should be aiming for that 50. We can only do that if we build a lot more housing. Okay, so that's the first point. Second point, I just want to underscore Cam's graph about our subsidized housing share versus New York. We're at 7, New York's at 23. Okay, there is one place in the world that is growing, that is rich, that basically does well in terms of housing, and that's Singapore. They spend 0.8% of GDP on housing in Singapore, subsidized housing subsidies in Singapore. We did the same thing in the US, we would spend about $240 billion a year on housing subsidies. We spend about a third of that, okay? So, yes, we need to build lots more housing, but without subsidy, we're not gonna solve it. So I say supply is a sufficient but not necessary condition for fixing this problem. So I want to leave you with those two thoughts. And now first of all, everyone who worked on this report, please stand up so that we can acknowledge you. Everyone in the room who worked on it. Or I see some people who worked on it who are standing, so why don't you sit down so we know who you are? No. And the final thing I want to say is I consider it a gift that neighborhood data for social change became part of the Law Center. It was 3 years ago, not 4. And a big part of that gift was getting to work with Caroline Bala. And what I want to say is there are people who know how to lead, and it's hard to describe what great leadership is, but you see the results of it. And I'm going to pick on Cam a little. I mean, Cam is fantastic. Cam would do great on his own, but I have no doubt that Caroline's mentorship is one of the reasons why Cam was so great today. I've seen her do this with person after person after person in the last 3 years. And it's just a thrill to see that kind of successful nurturing of talent. And so, Caroline, thank you so much for leading this project. And so last year we had 100, this year we have 260. So next year we're going to try to have space for 596 people. I think that's the correct exponent of where we were. We'll be back next year. And by the way, your questions, great suggestions, and the price index where's Ann Sewill? I love the price index for owning a place. That's a great idea. We're going to try to I'm not promising it, but we're going to try to do it. Thank you all for coming.